If you break it, do you own it? Welcome to the call. I'm Jay Sapsford. Over the weekend, the U.S. and Israel eliminated Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. Now, a nation of 90 million and one of China's biggest oil suppliers is facing the most intense uncertainty in nearly half a century. What comes next? A moderately authoritarian government? Or will the so-called Pottery Barn rule apply? You break it, you own it. So today's question, who will run Iran after the crisis? Joining us now is Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution. Suzanne, welcome to the call.
Thanks so much, Jay. Glad to be here.
So we're looking at the headlines coming in overnight, and we're seeing that the president is saying that this is going to be lasting for a number of weeks. I wonder what that tells you about both the goals of these attacks and the difficulties of execution.
Well, I think it's an excellent point. We don't really know for sure what the timeline will be, and we're, I think, still hearing different explanations of what the justification and objectives for these strikes are, in fact. We've heard different things from the president, including his remarks early Saturday morning when he announced that the operation had begun. At that time, he seemed to be talking about regime change. We've heard from Secretary Rubio, as well as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that the primary objective of this mission is to take out Iran's ballistic missile capabilities and other military material that enable Tehran to threaten its neighbors, and particularly Israel. We've also heard different stories from various Israeli officials as well. And so I think we won't really know the timeline until we fully understand what are the combined objectives and intentions for this war, which is now on its fourth day.
So assuming the goal is some sort of regime change, are strikes enough, or do we need to have boots on the ground in order to execute this? I noticed the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, was very careful not to get himself pinned down on that question.
Well, it's a question that academics and policy analysts have studied for many years, and there really is no successful track record of transition to a durable change of regime simply as a result of airstrikes. Fundamentally, having some sort of ground force presence would almost inevitably be necessary. And we have, in fact, heard, at least on one or two occasions, from the president and other U.S. officials and Israeli officials that might be something they contemplate. I think that my own sense is that President Trump has been focused very heavily on Iran, particularly since the June war, in which the U.S. and Israel managed to strike very effectively at Iran's nuclear program. And for the first time in more than 2 decades, Iran was no longer enriching uranium, no longer making tangible progress toward nuclear weapons capability. But it was still a very considerable threat. And then, of course, we saw the protests erupt in January. The president, early in the morning, was on social media talking about rescuing protesters. At that time, we didn't have the military capability to intervene. My sense is that this intervention owes as much to the vision of Iranians coming to the streets to denounce the regime and demand change as it did to any specific military objectives that the president is hoping to undertake. The challenge, of course, is, as your question implies, is that launching a successful campaign to take out military capabilities is much easier than launching a campaign to create a transition to a new and different and much more stable government.
Well, in seeking that transition, is there much of an organized opposition that the United States can partner with in this?
At this time, there doesn't appear to be any organized resistance. There has been a long history of opposition among wide swaths of the Iranian population to the current regime. They have come to the streets time and time again, but especially over the course of the past 8 years, in much larger numbers across the country, cross-sectarian, cross-ethnic, cities and small towns, young people and old people denouncing the regime, not just calling for a different leader, not just calling for a better economy, which has always been a big concern for Iranians, but really demanding change. But we haven't seen any particular individual come to the fore within the country. There is, of course, a large and very well-educated and wealthy Iranian diaspora in this country, and where the son of the former Shah, who was, of course, ousted in 1979 at the time this regime was established, Reza Pahlavi, lives in the United States, has become a much more vocal advocate for his people. However, he hasn't been to Iran in almost half a century. And while there does appear to be a great deal of sympathy toward him and toward the idea of a monarchy, I think the concept of someone who has not been on the ground in a half century coming to run either a revolution or a new state is highly unrealistic.
Now, Suzanne, speaking of business, we're putting up a chart that shows the importance of the Strait of Hormuz to world energy supplies. It provides 20% of the world's oil, roughly 15 million barrels of crude every day, and also on a daily basis, about 6 million barrels of petroleum products. Now, this morning, that strait is effectively closed. One of our members is asking the following question. Oil prices jumped again overnight. Stocks are weak, so are bonds, and the market and will the markets pressure Washington into a quick solution?
Well, I think the markets are certainly going to be on President Trump's mind and the minds of the rest of the administration in terms of how they try to prosecute this campaign. The challenge is, of course, the market is making some of these decisions that insurance companies, tanker shipping companies are looking at the situation, looking at the wrath that Iran has wrought against its neighbors, striking airports, civilian facilities, and increasingly over the course of the past 48 hours, striking energy and other economic infrastructure. And they're going to make their own calculation. And so it will become, even if the Iranians don't mind the straits, I think we're going to be in a position where the traffic will slow, the risk premium will be attached, and especially if we see sustained shutdowns of oil production by some of the neighboring states. We've heard announcements from Iraq today, as well as shutdowns of gas production from major exporters such as Qatar. That's going to be a real drain on the markets, and we know that the president watches these things very closely, and that it will have some effect.
One of the things that's really difficult for me to understand is why Iran would attack infrastructure of its neighbors and draw them into a fight. I mean, doesn't Iran already have big enough enemies in the United States and Israel?
Well, it certainly does have some powerful enemies, but Iran's strategy as a country that has always perceived itself as to some extent encircled by hostile neighbors has been to try to use its retaliation as a means of forcing diplomacy, of forcing an off ramp to a crisis. And so we saw, for example, in early 2020, when President Trump, during his first administration, assassinated Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Quds Force, the overseas arm of the Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran. That was the Iranians immediately responded by striking at their neighbors. They also responded to economic pressure at the time when the president implemented his maximum pressure strategy and walked away from the 2015 nuclear deal. The Iranians struck at tanker traffic in the Gulf. They struck at Saudi oil facilities at the time. And all of this is meant to really create incentives on the part of their neighboring states to try to drive towards some kind of a compromise, to try to put pressure on the United States to end the conflict sooner rather than later.
Well, the pressure on Iran itself has been considerable. We've got, before the attacks, we had massive unemployment. We've had high levels of corruption. We've had hyperinflation. How long can Iran keep sustaining this as the economy seems to be taking a turn for the considerably worse here?
Well, certainly Iran has been experiencing tremendous economic pressure internally. That is what drove Iranians to the streets in late December and early January, the precipitous decline in the value of the currency. And that will remain a significant issue. But right now, this is existential for the regime. And they are able to, really impose costs on their neighbors and impose costs potentially on the international community. We know that, the shutdown in Qatari gas production will have a direct impact on availability of supplies for heating and cooling in across Europe. We know that, if the strait are closed, that could have an impact over time on gasoline prices here in the United States, despite our own tremendous production capabilities. So this is their effectively their ace in the hole. They want to put pressure and they want to try to persuade the United States that extending this conflict and really driving the regime into the ground is going to hurt as much as it helps.
So, who is making the decisions here? You've written eloquently about these councils that have been formed in Iran. And according to President Masoud Pezeshkian, there's now one council that seems to be more equal than the other, so to speak. Is that the locus of power now? Is that our potential negotiating partner?
Well, at this point, authority is diffuse in Iran. It's a very well entrenched regime. The death of the supreme leader was an incredible symbolic blow, but he was 86 years old. His succession process had been underway, studied, focused on for literally all of his 36 plus years in office. And it had become a subject of public conversation much more frequently over the course of the past couple of years because of health and age concerns. And so there's a lot of redundancy built into this system. Pezeshkian is the president, which is a fairly uninfluential position in Iran. He is part of this council. I think the other two members of that council, the head of the judiciary and a member of the Guardians Council, as you say, it's a very Byzantine system. Two clerics with long experience, close to the helm, close to Khamenei himself. They will be quite influential. The other official that I think everyone watching at this point in time is Ali Larijani, who is a long-time security official, head of the Supreme National Security Council in Iran. And he is someone that has been pointed to as a potential interlocutor, although sometimes described as pragmatic. But within the Iranian context, that simply means very much less than it might in other contexts.
Okay, I'm going to bundle together two questions from our members related to some of Iran's allies. First, will China or Russia play a role in the influencing of the formation of a successor government? And secondly, again on China, will Beijing interpret this attack as a move to squeeze its interests and bolster leverage ahead of the Trump visit later this month?
Those are really interesting questions. Iran has strategic partnerships with both Moscow and Beijing, but they are, it is very much the weaker partner in both of those relationships, particularly with respect to China. The Chinese have much more investment, much more at stake in the future of the other side of the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Qatar, as well as other Arab countries. Iran is an important supply of discounted oil, much of which goes into their own strategic reserves. They won't want to see an Iranian government fall, I think. But at the same time, from the vantage point of both Moscow and Beijing, the extent to which the United States becomes bogged down in another crisis of its own making in the Middle East is actually quite beneficial to their interests. We're hearing mixed things about how Beijing might handle the upcoming leaders meeting. This will put some kind of a damper on it. I don't think the meeting will be canceled. I think that there may be a little less pomp and circumstance, and that might not be quite as welcome to the White House. So we'll have to see how that plays out.
So Iran is famous for being able to leverage its proxies around the region and do attacks. How does this impact that?
Most of his proxies have been severely degraded as a result of the Israeli campaign with American help since October 7th. And so we've seen Hezbollah get into the action somewhat belatedly. And now, of course, the Israelis have expanded their own strikes and potentially, I believe, today, ground troops into southern Lebanon. So the zone of conflict is expanding. But fundamentally, besides Hezbollah and the Houthis, many of Iran's proxies are not in the position to do a great deal of systemic harm. They can destabilize countries, particularly Iraq is one that we will have to watch. And Iran has the capability to launch sleeper cells that could hit at other parts of the world. That is also the wider threat of terrorism is something that we're going to have to watch. But I think the key factor in terms of the duration of the conflict and how things play out is the technology. Right now, the Iranians are trying to overwhelm the air defenses, not just of Israel this time, but of course, as you've mentioned, the Gulf states with which it has had a fairly constructive diplomatic relationship over the course of the past few years. They are very quickly running out of interceptors to shoot down drones and missiles that are coming from Iran. I think the finite number of the American supply of those interceptors is not available publicly. But most analysts are betting that the Iranians can last longer than some of our partners and allies in the region can at this time. They may not choose to. The Iranians are going to want to hold back at least some of their own capabilities. But we really are in a bit of a time crunch in terms of how long the region can sustain its own defense.
Yeah, there's a lot to follow up on there. One of our members is asking to this point about Iran's ability to project power beyond its borders. Do you think there will be retaliation on U.S. soil?
I think it's possible, but I don't think it's likely, and I don't think it's imminent. This is a regime that will lie in wait for its adversaries, and so they will look for some opportunity to exact vengeance for the death of Khamenei. But I would say many of us anticipated that in the aftermath of the Soleimani assassination in early 2020. Of course, things were disrupted by the pandemic, but we haven't seen that play out in practice. There are a number of former Trump administration officials who had been given protection because of credible threats to their lives from that operation. President Trump himself, in his current term, removed that protection. And so I imagine that there are some former officials who are watching the world quite carefully right now.
So this is affecting the economy of one of the most dynamic regions of the world. One of our members is noting that flights have been shut down, commercial flights have been shut down, and wondering how long it's going to be before those are back in the air. I know that's a difficult question to answer without speculating, but including that, what is the outlook for the economy on the other side of this? Is there a longer-term positive story here that the business community might affect the playing field here for businesses?
Well, look, if there were to be an actual transformation of the government in Iran in some meaningful way, even if it went by the same moniker, even if it had some of the same officials, if you had a government that was willing to dispense with its hostility to the United States and Israel and to stop funding terrorism essentially leave its nuclear program in the ground where it has been buried by American Israeli bombs, Iran would be a phenomenal opportunity for the world and for its own people. It's incredibly well educated, tremendous resources, has a dynamic and diversified economy, and has for well before the oil boom. This is really a country that could do so much, but its government has held its back. It has held it back, and I'm afraid that that is likely to continue. In terms of the prospects for reopening airports, the Iranians understand that their neighbors are vulnerable, that they rely heavily on sort of their connections to the global economy. They've invested heavily in tourism, and so it's very easy for them to launch a drone, a small missile to try to hit and just deter people from coming, and that is part of their pressure points on the Gulf states. I'd also note that, for both the Saudis and the Emiratis, there has been a big push into tech. There's trying to attract a lot of tech investment. And I think that we've seen already that at least one data center in the Emirates was hit. That's going to cause a big concern. This is the future for these countries. They're looking to transition away from oil-based economies and move to, a tech-based future. And if that's jeopardized by these attacks, I think this is going to become an existential crisis for the Gulf states as well.
Well, it's interesting that, as part of that transformation you were talking about, the Abraham Accords were pretty central to that. Iran probably did more than any other country to derail those. If we had, even if it's an authoritarian government, one that was a little bit more moderate, could we be optimistic about the prospects of getting the Abraham Accord process back on track?
I would love to believe that that's possible. I think at this point in time, it seems highly unlikely. But let's be clear: Iran, before the revolution, had a very constructive relationship with Israel, both in terms of diplomacy and in terms of economics and trade. Iran still has the largest population of Jews in the Middle East outside of Israel. It's very tiny still, but it's larger than its neighbors. That multi-ethnic population is an important part of Iran's resilience and potentially also its vulnerability. I think the key question in terms of the Abraham Accords, really concerns Saudi Arabia and the state of play in Gaza and the extent to which there can be some kind of future for the Palestinians that enables the Saudis to actually join the Abraham Accords. The Iranians will inevitably be behind that.
So the Venezuela precedent out there still looms large. It seems like the Trump administration is going for a model where you replace the leadership or decapitate and then use elements of the existing government to keep the country running, so that you don't get a situation like we had in Iraq when we had a bunch of soldiers out without a job and a bunch of weapons. Do you think that Venezuela, in the end, is actually turning out to be a precedent for what's going on in Iran?
No, I don't think that there's a commonality here. This is a much more entrenched system. It's not a sort of one-man rule with a authoritarian state that can simply be transferred in terms of both the management and in terms of the ideology to somebody else. These are true believers. They have spent their lives devoted to the cause of the radical theocracy that runs Iran. They're not going to simply turn over a new leaf simply because Ayatollah Khamenei is now gone. In fact, if anything, I think, this sets back the cause of any kind of reform. We will have to wait and see. It's possible that over time, the attrition of the actual leadership could create an opportunity for someone who has a different vision, but I don't see that in the near term in the offing.
Well, given our member interests, we're going a little bit long here, so please do bear with me. We're putting up another chart here, Suzanne, that came as a surprise to me. We associate Iran with ethnic Persians, but that group makes up only a slight majority. Estimates vary, but all agree that the majority is somewhere between 50 and 60%. Now, the rest of the country is made up by Azeris, Kurds, and other ethnic minorities, all of whom might have their own interests. So my question, is there a risk that dissatisfied minorities will seize this opportunity to break the country apart?
Think there are actual risks in terms of ethnic separatism in Iran. I think there's a risk if we try to advance that, and there have been some here in Washington and elsewhere in the region who have suggested that that might be a way to try to undermine the regime. I think it would be very dangerous. Iran has a long history as a multi-ethnic empire before, of course, it became a modern state. And so, there is a true sense of Iranian nationhood that is shared across those ethnic divisions. But there are also areas of the country where some of these different ethnic groups, whether it's Kurds or Baluch or Arab, may be concentrated that tend to be more economically deprived, that tend to have more agitation, and of course have co-ethnic populations across borders. We saw in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution, there were tribal revolts, there was a lot of instability. That did not drive a better outcome for the post-revolutionary state. It actually gave a hand to the extremists and the militants within the revolutionary coalition. I would be very concerned about a set of circumstances in which we are either hoping for or helping to fuel ethnic separatism in Iran, because I think it would end in the same way, some kind of a very hardline government.
All right, as a final question, if you were a business person with operations in the Gulf, what would you be watching most closely right now?
I'd simply be watching for the trajectory of this conflict and some clarity about what the president is trying to achieve. Can we find an off ramp that would enable business as usual to resume? That seems to be still uncertain from the perspective of both the United States and Israel. And until we sort that out, I think all of our partners and allies in the region are very much at the whims of the decision making here.
All right, well, we deeply appreciate you joining us today and shedding light on this extraordinary moment. Suzanne Maloney, Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution, thank you so much for swinging by.
Thank you.
All right, our audience has had their shot of informational espresso and is ready to tackle the day. Next week, we'll have former NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine on the coming launch of the Artemis II space mission and the implications for business. We'll also have a guest host next week, the Chamber's Executive Vice President Neil Bradley, who will be sitting in for me. Missed a live episode? Catch the replay on our website, LinkedIn, or on YouTube. You can also listen to the call's podcast edition on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your pods. Thank you to you, our members, for joining us today. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.